Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video 199 on some mound builders, pre-Columbian Vikings, some of these sometimes pseudo-scientific topics, but also very strange ones. By the way, I just swallowed a gnat when I was trying to make this video before. After 10 minutes of speaking, I had to redo the video, and it was a difficult issue, but gnats don't like coffee, so you simply drink more of that. Figure I got a little bit of extra protein, a few 5 calories or whatever it'd be worth. But we got to talk about some of these things. Now, I've already spoken to a slight degree about some of the sort of heretical archaeology topic, but I figured I would cover it in a little bit more detail. For instance, for those of you who are not aware, which unfortunately is probably most of you, unless you took advanced U.S. history or you're in archaeology/anthropology, you probably don't know really anything about the mound building civilizations, which is funny because at their height, they were more impressive than the Mayans or the Aztecs or any of the other groups that ever existed within the Americas. That is, you had to have, it doesn't take much technology to fill a bucket with dirt and dump it somewhere and keep doing that until you make like a step pyramid or something. Technologically, it doesn't take that much. Organization-wise and manpower-wise, to make it, hundreds of feet around, yeah, that takes a lot of social organization and a hell of a lot of extra time that groups back in antiquity, the average group of people, what sort of spare time did they have outside of the winter months? The mound builders weren't building mounds of dirt in winter. Yeah, good luck chopping through the soil once it's frozen to a depth of several feet. That obviously didn't happen. Rather, they would have been doing it in the temperate part of the year when apparently they were horticulturalists for the most part, and pastoral. They had herds. They understood the concept of breeding animals. They understood, obviously they were fishing and hunting and doing all these things. But the static, obviously, nature of these remains, that fact, to me, definitely underlies the fact that they were only semi-nomadic. They had to have had some degree of stability locally. There had to have been trade and travel for goods. They used copper, we know that, although it was more limited. I think that the reason why we have few remains in some cases, in part is the result of Victorian-era destruction. That is, when roads and rail and stuff were going up, a lot of times if these mounds had stone in them, they'd quarry the rock, in all honesty, to build walls or even houses and stuff. Another thing is erosion. You got to understand the plains, especially, extremely diverse region with regards to weather. One moment you can have a drought, and then the rains come. You get a couple thunderstorms, and half those mountains might have been washed away. What passes now for an irregular hill could be, in fact, the remnants of a mound. Now, by the way, it's very funny. Here's the heretical side. It's established that Mesoamerican groups built these megaliths. That's established and known. We've got the remains. They can be genetically tested. Now, we know that for a fact. But despite the fact that they were building these remains at least as far northeast as western New York, it is considered totally heretical to suggest that the same people may have built a few stone huts, basically, as they exist here, in New England and down across the Appalachians. There are some degree of these remains. I can't remember exactly how many. I've been inside one. Over in Woodstock area on one of the hills that's, I believe, just slightly south of Woodstock, Vermont, if I remember. Can't remember exactly. I think it's on the way to Brattleboro. Literally, you turn off the road up this dirt embankment for a few hundred feet, and there's this little stone room, you could call it. It's got, I believe, about a 5-foot door, about a 6-foot ceiling. It's a little bit shorter than me. It's not a very impressive structure, other than the massive stone lintels on top that have to weigh several tons. Who built it and for what purpose, they're not sure. It is astronomically aligned, as are all of these remains. That doesn't point to a Victorian or post-Victorian date of creation. Some people have tried to say, well, they're colonial remains. Why would they have lined it up with the solstice? They at the time, back in the 1700s, they wouldn't have cared if it lined up with the solstice. They would have built it according to the contours of the hillside. They probably wouldn't have built it on a hillside at all. Why the fuck would they have built it up 200 feet above their settlement? It wouldn't have made any sense whatsoever. These are astronomical sites. They have some sort of, I believe, spiritual and symbolic importance. That points either to a pre-secular European diaspora. Some people have claimed Vikings or even Irish explorers may have made them. The latter, honestly, seems more likely. There were Irish explorations back in the pre-Columbian period. Some of them didn't return to Ireland. Where could they have gone? This would be the sort of structure they would have created. They could have interbred with local native populations or been killed off, of course. Here's the thing. Here's the big thing. Very little archaeology, all things considered, has been performed in the New England area, with the exception of around settled areas. Like if occasionally they'll be building a sidewalk in Burlington, they'll find 5 or 6 skeletons. Native American, colonial era, they don't know. So occasionally they'll dig up an old graveyard of kids or something like that. It's actually quite fascinating how many remains are really there, but that's only in the valleys. Most of Vermont is mountains and hills. Almost no archaeology has ever been conducted in them because until very, very recently, the general consensus is nobody would live here. There wouldn't be any remains here. In some cases, erosion probably makes that true. There's no reason to dig test pits up on this hillside. And in some cases, because of the protection of Native American remains, you can't even dig test pits. What I think they should do is go to these locations, like the stone room there in Woodstock. Native American tribes have said, this is a native remain, it is illegal for you to touch it. Okay, very well, dig test pits out as far as you have to go and ring the whole thing with them and see if you find any remains corroborating that. You should find a couple arrowheads or maybe a skull at some point. Obvious, if it's a sacred space, you'd think for some degree of distance around it, you'd find something. Somebody walking to or fro the area, they lose their bow and their arrows, the arrowheads are there. They lose a bit of charcoal, something like that. You'd expect to find some remains. They traveled to and from it if it was a sacred place, probably. They didn't just build it and leave. If it supposedly is, or you'd find like colonial remains. Maybe you find, the remnants of an old musket or something like that from the 1600s. That's what I think they should do. And then we have to talk about Vikings, pre-Columbian in nature. Link in the description to an extremely good film clip. It's In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, rest in peace. Again, I knew him way, way more as host of In Search Of and Ancient Mysteries than anything Star Wars related. I mean, I knew he was Spock, but I didn't give a fuck. I'm sitting there watching, these really, really great... This is like the golden age of sort of the heretical science thing, was basically, the mid to late 70s through the 80s. Golden age of all this stuff. And then it comes back in the 2000s, but gets more derpy with like Ancient Aliens. It's really funny. But Ancient Aliens now is bigger than CNN's. I'm not surprised. It's way more informative. It's probably more true. We got to talk about, though, the Pre-Columbian Vikings. Because back in the 70s, and I've noticed this when I rewatched it fairly recently. Back in the 70s when this was first made, this basically this infotainment documentary of sorts, and more entertaining than infotaining, it was considered heretical. The idea that Vikings made it to the North American continent at all was considered, for any purpose other than they hunted here for a while and then went back to Greenland, it was considered not true. They're like, hey, there's no Viking remains. There's nothing we can corroborate that's from Europe in the pre-Columbian era. There were a few, again, very heretical findings, like Kensington stone or something. But other than that, there was no evidence. Now, of course, it's verified. We know, archaeologically it's been shown, there are Viking remains in North America. Now the big debate isn't over whether they got here, it's over how long were they here and how expansive was their reach. Some people are saying, well, they made it down to Maine. Look at the Maine Penny. Or there's that one tower, I can't remember the name of it, the one that some people think is a primitive lighthouse. They think it was Viking or Irish in creation. They think it's, most people think it's Victorian. It's like a fairly recent creation. It's colonial. Jury's still out technically. You found other remains. You think of the Clovis points point to the possibility that possibly Archaic era Europeans may have made it across. At the time, during the Ice Age, it would have been physically possible. It would have been physically possible for a displaced group of people to follow essentially along the lines of the ice sheets. It would have been possible. Did that actually happen? Possibly, possibly not. If they did, they would have interbred with local tribes. So it's not like, we're talking about, there were European diaspora populations settling in southeastern U.S. No, we're talking they made it there and probably interbred very quickly, thus adding a small component of the genetic lineage of some of these tribes. I think more genetic testing would be necessary to show that, obviously. As far as the Vikings go, though, back in the 70s, some of these sites were considered to be native sites. That is, that they looked at them and they said, well, yeah, it kind of looks like a longhouse. This kind of looks like a buried longboat. That kind of looks like a Viking axe. But no, it can't be. It can't be. Columbus was the first person in the continent, even though he wasn't. Until the 1400s, Europeans didn't even know that the Americas existed, so it couldn't possibly be that this is a pre-colonial Viking remain. We now know that's false. In fact, there are multiple sites that have been corroborated as having been, Norse in nature. What happened to them? Well, if you don't find any burial remains, you'd think they probably interbred with the local population. That is, that some of these groups, in especially coastal Canada, these native groups, they're part Viking. Yeah, absolutely. It's like maybe 5% of their genetic component, but yeah, they're part Norse. It's very funny. And it's even funnier when you think of like Minnesota. And the Kensington stone being found just happens to be found in an area primarily populated by people of Swedish and Norwegian extraction. That is a little bit odd. However, like when, what was his name? Walter Scott, I think it was, when he analyzed the stone. And this ties into the sort of the medieval era Viking thing. He did, some people are trying to claim, well, he's not an archaeologist. True, he's a geologist by trade. That means that if he's looking at the decomposition of the surface of the Kensington stone, he would be considered an expert in that field. And yet people want to dismiss that completely because he primarily believes that it is a Viking remain. But it is corroborated that it's been heavily weathered. It is corroborated that indeed it appears that it's an authentic relic. Again, some people consider it pseudoscience, some people accept it, some people are skeptics in the truest sense, and they're like, the jury is still out. Then we've got like giant humanoids. I'd just like to say for the record, the Smithsonian covering up giant humanoids thing is largely bunk. Most of these stories that you have from this are literally from nothing more than spook tales that were told at the time and endlessly recirculated through newspapers throughout the United States. It's not limited to the mound builders. It spread far further, including to New England. At the time, there was a craze of people apparently thinking that giant humanoids had been found, and so people naturally replicated those claims to get attention or to get money. We've got famous cases where stone was carved to look like a giant skeleton. It's like, oh, the giant petrified 10-foot skeleton. Come pay me 5 cents, kids. You can come see the giant that, you know, obviously was the remains of a Nephilim. And it tied over into the religiosity, the fire and brimstone uprising of the day. It was essentially, hey, we know the Bible's true. Satan really is a roaring lion. Jesus, we'll probably find him out in the woods at some point if we search hard enough. Those dinosaur skeletons are just dragons. And look, there's Nephilim too, of course. Most of these were hoaxes. However, there have been a few abnormally large skeletons found among the mound builders. But we're not talking like 10 feet tall. We're talking like 6'6" or something. It would have been extremely abnormal, but the thing is, what if someone simply got gigantism at the time? They'd been deformed. They definitely were a giant even by modern standards, though. They could have played basketball really well. The Mesoamerican mound building basketball team would have been a sight to behold. It would have been quite funny. So yeah. And also, you got to understand that some of these groups were working with copper at the time, when supposedly they had nothing more than, you know, stone tools and stuff. That would show, again, it would show a level of an increase in technology and necessarily of organization capable of building the mound. Some people want to say that that's like a European diaspora. Oh yeah, pre-medieval Europeans made it. They made all the mounds and they got killed off. This corroborates the Mormons or something. Okay, the Book of Mormon that says that they rode elephants into battle. Talks about pre-Spaniard contact horses in the United States. That didn't happen. Or Jesus in, what was it, Montgomery County, Alabama or something. That didn't happen. That's religious superstition. The mound builders do not verify that. In fact, they sort of argue against it. They argue for a level of social complexity among some of these groups that is simply greater than the primitivism that was perceived by colonial individuals. They looked at them, they said, like noble savage, like, oh, these groups are primitive. They have wood and rock and not much else. They're very simplistic people and have all these weird spiritual tales. Indeed, their ancestors, though, had been, at least in some cases in the Central Plains, far more sophisticated. They were megalith builders. They weren't living in huts. They were living in a megalithic city-states, essentially. High degree of social order. It would have been on par with the Mayans or the Aztecs. And a lot of people don't even know that this entire structure of civilizations existed in the first place. They don't even know that it existed. It really is a remarkable thing. You got to understand. We have only explored an extremely tiny proportion of the world's surface. Generally, in and around areas we're already settling in modernity. We've only searched a few recognizable structures, often with a tip-off because you can see something above ground that it's there. That's all the archaeology that mankind in the last couple centuries has ever done. And before that, of course, you don't have organized archaeology until roughly the Napoleonic era with the Rosetta Stone and some of these things. Because of the heavy fixation on Egypt and Rome especially for most of human history, very little has been conducted outside of the classical world. The Americas, most of Asia outside of, and China prevents you from doing archaeology. They've got a pyramid there that they covered over with a bunch of trees to make it less obvious that there were pyramids in China. We got pyramids in Brazil. Until fairly recently, they didn't know they were there. They were covered with rainforest. They just look like a hill. Now, of course, we know there are megalithic stone pyramids in fucking Brazil, of all places. Supposedly, no civilization with any degree of social structure could have existed there. By the way, it just happens to overlap with the area that's been turned into Terra Preta, aka it was probably heavily farmed for many centuries. It had to have had an incredible amount of output at its height. It's an area the size of all fucking Great Britain, essentially, that has been fundamentally chemically transformed into many, many feet of fertile agricultural soil in an otherwise sterile area. By the way, Terra Preta, by decompacting itself and absorbing carbon dioxide, is capable of replicating itself to some degree. It's actually very, very funny. That's about all. Peace out.